Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. Well, as the sun gets long in the day and the shadows come here at Firestone Farm, I'm excited to be back with my friend Deb Reed, Curator of Agriculture and the Environment here at the Henry Ford. Civil War Digital Digest is proud to support Greenfield Village in its Digital Fall Flavors event this year. So much is going crazy. Unfortunately, this event can't be brought to you in person, so we're happy to bring another slice of the fall flavors to you digitally. Deb, today let's talk about apples in the Civil War. Let's just start broadly. Why apples?
They are a multi-use fruit. They're good at multitasking, you could say.
Let's talk about apples and what types of apples, not necessarily the varieties of apples, but what broad categories of apples based on what you'd use them for in the house.
Mm-hmm. I think the most were cooking apples, simply because you cook apples into many different things. Cooking apples are distinctive because when they're cooked, they create this consistent and very even pulp. That's their purpose. So think applesauce or cooked further apple butter, pies. Those are all the product of the best cooking apples. Then we're not sure how much people ate apples raw, but there were table apples, or what they called dessert apples. And those were apples that they said, go ahead and eat them raw. So we assume they did. And those tended to be aromatic and very flavorful. Smaller, too, than the cooking apples. And then there are cider apples, which can also include quinces, so not even just apples. But these apples that were bitter to the taste, you wouldn't want to eat them, cooked or otherwise. But they make a perfectly acceptable cider. So apples are one of these things that families invested a lot in, and they accumulated a range of apples to make sure that they had apples basically 12 months a year.
So when do we harvest apples? Today we think about harvesting apples in early September to beginning of a 2-month window. When do we harvest during the Civil War in the mid-19th century?
From July or early August up through December.
Wow, so almost
Yes.
half the year.
Yes.
How do we do that?
Well, that tree that's right behind me is an early harvest. So you would set up your orchard. You have to pre-plan. It'll take at least 5 years for a small tree to bear. But you would have early harvests that are going to come fresh, you could say, in July and August. Then you're going to have apples that are going to start ripening in September, and then October, and then November and December. And you just stretch them out that way.
Stretch them out by having different species.
Varieties, yes. Well, varieties or cultivars. The long story short, humans have manipulated apples and made these repeated clones, basically. So they create the parent by cloning with scions or buds and grafting that onto rootstock. So that you wouldn't necessarily call a variety because it's been manipulated by humans, not nature.
Okay, so I don't just take a seed out of the middle of an apple and plant it in the ground and get the apple.
You can. You will get an apple, but you will not get the parent. So the seed will not replicate its parent. But you might get a different apple that actually is fine. But do you want to risk that if you're 5 years in the making of a tree? So you usually turn to a catalog or to your local store that would be able to get you the apples, different types, different cultivars to suit your needs.
Well, that sounds very modern, and that's how we do it today. How do we do it in the mid-19th century?
Very much the same way. Of course, there's no internet, so you have to personally know the folks that know the growers that have the stock. And there were salesmen that you could say roam the countryside with their sales books, helping retailers, so store owners, get the variety of apples that they thought that the local population could need.
That takes us out of the orchard, as it were. We harvest the apples. What are the ways we can store it?
Yes, so those summer apples you cannot store because they turn pithy practically immediately. So you're going to eat them fresh. You might fry them which is my favorite way of eating them, with bacon grease and sugar.
Tell me a little more.
Well, that's about it. You just you harvest, and you harvest them when they're nice and firm, but you'll harvest them as long as they're there. And then you slice a skillet full with bacon grease in the bottom, and you just put a lid on it and let it slowly fry. They're cooking apples, so they create a very consistent, even pulp. And that's the hallmark of a cooking apple. Whereas that dessert or eating apple, or sometimes called a table apple, is nice and fresh to your tongue. Tart, usually really flavorful and aromatic. So Firestone Farm, they have some planted outside the kitchen, and those are what they call their table apples. And there are some apples that do both. So the Rhode Island Greening was a really popular apple, and it was both a cooking and a table apple.
What are we using cider for in the Civil War era, and what do we do with it?
So you could drink cider fresh. So cider is the entire apple pulverized and then pressed. And there are terms for all the parts of the process. But that has some pulp in it, and it is meant to be drank fresh. Apple juice is strained,
okay,
if you want to be more of a purist, and there may have been health and medicinal properties. If you want to make hard cider, then you ferment for a specific period of time to change that juice to turn the sugar basically into ethanol, that alcohol.
And that'll preserve it because now it's alcohol.
Yes. And so you would put that in a barrel in your cellar. So you were taking those apples and turning them into a new product, but you're preserving them in essence.
Well, okay, preserving. How else might we preserve apples? We've got the apple coming off for 6 months of the year, but you said we use apples all year long. Besides hard cider, how else would we go ahead and preserve apples?
Yes. So another important byproduct of apples is apple cider vinegar. So that starts with that cider and then moves through the hard cider phase and continues to ferment to make an acidic acid, basically.
And what would we use that for?
Well, preserving other things. So pickling vegetables. So not the slow fermentation, which is just salt, but actual pickling process. Vinegar is essential. People used it for health-related things. Switchel in the summertime, you can put a little vinegar in water and, take it into the hayfield and remain, able to hay for the day.
So we've got liquid ways to preserve the apples, but if we're going to use the apples the whole year and we have them available from July until December, how else? Could we keep the apple for baking, say, in February?
Yes, the apples might be scrawny, shriveled. In order to keep those apples that are harvested in December, they're easy keepers, or they're good keepers. So you would layer them with straw in a bin in your root cellar. And then you're constantly making sure that none of them are starting to rot, because that bad apple will rot the entire group. But you take them out and you're going to bake with them. They're usually cooking apples that are going to last the longest.
So Deb, cider, where is it made? How is it made? Talk to me a little bit about that in the era.
Yes, so people might have had their own hand-cranked cider press, but it was more of a community endeavor. So there would be a person that would set up a mill for the season. So he might be operating a wool mill or a sawmill other parts of the year, but at harvest time for apples, he would set up, and this is really September, October, he would set up a cider press. Or maybe not set it up, it would be there, but he would operate it. And so folks would haul in apples, and they knew exactly how much you would take, and you would get the equivalent back in cider, which you could then barrel and ferment, or they would sell then on to a vinegar factory.
Well, let me ask this. We're recording for September in late August, and you talk about those cider mills being set up in September and October. I'm surprised that we have lush green trees and no red here.
No apples, no green apples, no russet apples, no red apples.
What happened, and how does that relate to farming?
Frost. So the thing that farmers cannot control is the weather. And the apple trees were in full bloom, and there was a frost. So there's one branch of one tree that has some apples. But otherwise, veritably 30 trees, no apples.
Wow, and that's just part of farming, whether it's the Civil War or whether it's today. Thanks for spending your time with
Thank
us.
you.
We really appreciate it. Thanks for spending your time with us at Civil War Digital Digest. A special thanks to our patrons, the CWDD Coffee Grinders, whose financial support makes all of this possible. We hope this discussion of apples and farming in the Civil War era gave you another small connection to life, both for the soldiers before they went to the war and for the folks who stayed home. This gives you a small connection to what life was like during the Civil War era. We'll see you in a few weeks.